In this video, we're going to be talking about the moveCandyToFirstRow method, which attempts to ensure that the box element, which is this instance variable of candy, at row 0 and column call, which is the parameter that's being passed in, contains a piece of candy using the following steps. If the element at row 0 and column call already contains a piece of candy, then box is unchanged and the method returns true. If the element at row 0 and column call does not contain a piece of candy, then the method searches the remaining rows of column call for a piece of candy. If a piece of candy can be found in column call, it is moved to row 0, its previous location is set to null, and the method returns true. Otherwise, the method returns false. And then we're given some examples of these boxes of candy and their locations and some method calls that we'll get into later. So let's go ahead and start writing some pseudocode so we can orient ourselves. So we know that there are 3 different situations that could be true of this box of candy. The first one is that there already is a piece of candy at row 0 in the column that's being passed in. So in that case, we can just return true because we don't need to rearrange anything in the box of candy, and we already have a piece of candy in that first row. So check if the first row of that column has a piece of candy or not. If it does, return true. So this one is sort of the easiest case where we just return true if we found that there's actually a piece of candy. The second condition is if there isn't a piece of candy in that first row, we need to loop over each of the rows in that column to see if we can find a piece of candy to move to that first row. So loop over all the rows after the first row in that column. Why do we do it after the first row? Well, we've already established that the first row doesn't have any candy in it, and we don't need to check the first row again. So we can just go ahead and move on to the second row. So what do we do inside this loop? If we find a row in that column that has a piece of candy in it, set the first row of that column to that piece of candy, set that row, the one that we just took that piece of candy from, to null, and the final thing we need to do is return true. So this is the case where we did find a piece of candy to move to the first row, and so we're going to be returning true. And that's all the logic inside of the loop. So outside of the loop, if we have not returned already, what's going to happen is we didn't have any pieces of candy to move into that first row. So you could kind of think of this as the entire column of candy was empty. So in this situation, what we're going to be doing is just returning false. So return false if we could not find a piece of candy put in the first row. And that should be it for our pseudocode. Let's go ahead and convert this into actual code. So checking if the first row of that column has a piece of candy or not. So this sounds like it's going to be an if statement. So if, remember that 2D arrays are row major. So when you're indexing a 2D array, the first number is going to be the row number, and the second number is going to be the column number. So we're checking if the first row of a specific column has a piece of candy or not. So what we would pass in is 0, because they're also 0 indexed, and column as our second number. So what do we need to check? If it has a piece of candy or not. So remember that earlier in the description it says that if it doesn't have a piece of candy, the value will be null. So what we're going to be checking is the opposite of that. So if it's not null, that means that there has to be a piece of candy in that specific row and column. So if it doesn't, what we can do is just return true. Otherwise, we need to loop over all the rows after the first row in that column. So we're looping through rows, so I'm going to go ahead and call my variable row. So int row, I'm going to start it off at 1. We don't need to check the 0th row because we would have already either returned true or it would have been empty. So just starting at the first row, we need to check that it's less than the number of rows in this box. So what we can do to get the number of rows in a 2D array, we would just do box.length. Okay, that's the number of rows. And remember, because it's a row major, so this is the number of rows. If we wanted to find the number of columns, we would do something like that, where we get the length of a specific array. But since we want to find the number of rows, we're going to do box.length, and then we're going to do row plus plus because we want to go through every single row. after the first one, of course. So if we find a row that has a piece of candy in it, what does that look like? Well, we're going to use that same exact check that we did for if the first row of the column had a piece of candy or not. We're just going to change the sort of coordinates, if you will. So we're using this looping variable to determine which row we're on. That's the first number we pass in. And then we know it's always going to be in that same column that was passed in as a parameter. So that's going to be our second number that we're passing in. We want to check if it does not equal null. So if there is a piece of candy, it's not going to equal null. What's going to happen? So we're going to set the first row of that column to whatever candy was in that row and column. So the 0th row of the column is going to equal box at row call. Now that we've moved it to the first row, we need to set the row that we're currently looking at to null, because the piece of candy is no longer at that coordinate. And then the last thing we need to do is return true, because we moved a piece of candy into that first row and we don't need to keep looping. So that should be it for our logic inside of our for loop. If we make it through all the rows in the box of candy and we didn't return true, we're going to have to return false, because in that case we did not find a piece of candy to put in the first row. So let's go ahead and try out these sample method calls. So the first one is moveCandyToFirstRow, and it passes in the 0th column, so that would be the first column in this box of candy. We check whether the first row of that column is not equal to null. So if it already has a piece of candy in it, it doesn't. When we index box of 0, 0, it is actually null because it's empty, it doesn't have a piece of candy in it, so we don't return true. Then we look at the rest of the rows in that column. So we set row equal to 1. We make sure that's less than the number of rows in the box, which is 4. It is less than 4, so we can go ahead and check the next row below the first row. So that would be box of 1, 1, 0. So this is also equal to null, so we cannot go into the if statement. So we increment our row again. We're looking at the third row in the box now. So 2, 0, also equal to null. We cannot do any of the logic inside of the if statement. Increment our row again. We're looking at the fourth and final row, row index 3. We check if that row in that column has any candy in it. It doesn't. It's also equal to null. So then when we try to increment our row again, 4 is no longer less than 4. So we're done with our for loop logic. And since we did not find a single piece of candy in that row to move to the first row, we're going to return false for this method call. And that matches up with what the problem statement says. The second method call is moveCandyToFirstRow1. So now we're looking at column 1. So that would be the second column in the box of candy. First, we need to check if the first row of that column has a piece of candy or not. So we are going to be grabbing box of 0, 1. This does not equal null, right? Because it equals lime. It has a piece of candy in it. That's lime flavored, I guess. So what we can do is return true, because there already is a piece of candy in that first row of that column. So we don't need to do any of the shifting logic. The third and final method call is moveCandyToFirstRow2. So we're looking at the third column in the box of candy. So first we check whether there is a piece of candy in the first row of that column. So box 0, 2. Unfortunately, it is equal to null. There is no candy at that coordinate, so we cannot return true. So we're going to go ahead and start looping. So row equals 1. Make sure it's less than the number of rows in the box, which is 4. We go ahead and we grab box of 1, 2, which is null. There's no candy inside of it. So we go ahead and we increment our row variable again. So now we're looking at box 2, 2. Luckily, box 2, 2 is cherry. It's a cherry flavored piece of candy. So it's not equal to null. So we can go ahead and do the switching logic here. So what we're going to do is set box 0, 2 equal to box at 2, 2. So we're taking that cherry flavored piece of candy and we're moving it into the first row of this column. Okay, but we can't have 2 cherry flavored pieces of candy, right? We only had 1 originally in this whole column, so we need to set the second row of the second column to null. because we have moved that piece of candy. And then lastly, we're going to return true. So we were successful in moving candy to the first row. So this method call would return true. And then this is what our box of candy would look like after this moveCandyToFirstRow method is called, where now we have cherry in the first row of that column. Something to point out also is you could have moved the grape candy to the first index. So while this solution is one of the solutions you could have had for this problem, you could have also, I guess, maybe like looped backwards through the rows to find candy and then like moved grape to the first row instead. Either one of those is okay by the College Board standards. So if your solution looks slightly different than mine, don't be afraid. There are many different ways to solve this problem. If we get rid of the pseudocode, here is what our moveCandyToFirstRow method looks like. Hopefully this helps you out with this problem. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them down below and I'll get back to you. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.